My name is Arthur Pemberton. I'm 98 years old, and I have been carrying a secret for 57 years that has cost me more sleep than I can count and more peace than I probably deserve to keep. I let my brother go to prison for something I did. I let him go, and I said nothing. And I have lived a full and comfortable life in the years since, while he did not. That is the truth of who I am. Not the husband, not the father, not the retired school teacher who coached Little League for 22 years and got a plaque at the end of it. Underneath all of that, underneath every ordinary Wednesday and every Christmas morning and every ordinary cup of coffee I have ever poured, there has been this. There has always been this. I want to tell you the whole story because I think I owe that to someone. I have told pieces of it to my priest. I have told the edges of it to my oldest daughter, who looked at me with an expression I still cannot name and then changed the subject and never brought it back up. I have not told it to anyone completely, from the beginning to the end, the way it actually happened. I am going to try to do that now. I do not know how much time I have left. At 98, you stop pretending that time is something you have an abundance of, and you start thinking about what you are going to leave behind and what that says about who you were. I want to leave behind the truth, at least. Maybe that is a selfish thing. Maybe telling the truth this late is more for me than for anyone else. I have thought about that. I think it might be both. I think it can be both. I was born in 1926. In a small town in western Pennsylvania called Mill Haven. It does not exist anymore. Not really. The mill closed in the late 50s, and most of the families who had been there for 3 generations packed up and scattered. And now, if you drive through what used to be Mill Haven, you see a gas station and a dollar store and a field where the elementary school used to stand. But when I was young, it was a real place, a tight-knit, hard-working, slightly claustrophobic place where everybody knew your name and your father's name and your grandfather's name and what your family was worth and what your family owed. That last part mattered more than people like to admit. In a place like that, reputation was currency. My father understood that. He built a small hardware business, and he ran it the way he ran everything, which was carefully, quietly, and with a great deal of attention to what other people thought. My brother Thomas was 4 years younger than me. He came into the world in 1930, and from the beginning, he was different from me in every way that seemed to matter in a town like Mill Haven. I was cautious. Thomas was not. I followed the rules because I understood instinctively that rules were a kind of protection. Thomas followed them only when he felt like it, which was not often. He was not a bad person. I want to say that clearly, because I think people hear a story like mine and they start filling in the villain before the story gets there, and Thomas was not that. He was just alive in a way that made other people nervous. He laughed too loud. He spent money before he had it. He fell in love with the wrong girls and said the wrong things to the right people and showed up late to everything that mattered. My father was constantly embarrassed by him and constantly bailing him out. And somehow, that combination of embarrassment and rescue had the effect of making Thomas believe that things would always work out in the end, because they always had. I loved him. I need you to understand that. I loved Thomas the way you love someone who makes your life both harder and more interesting, who pulls you out of your own careful habits and makes you feel, occasionally, like the world is bigger than you thought. I was not an adventurous person by nature. Around Thomas, sometimes I was. That is the other part of this story, the part I have spent decades trying not to look at directly. I was not an innocent bystander who got pulled along by his reckless brother. I made choices. On that particular night in 1967, I made choices, and then I made more choices in the days that followed, and all of them added up to what happened. In 1967, I was 41 years old. I had been married to my wife Eleanor for 14 years. We had 3 children, the oldest of whom was 12, and the youngest of whom had just turned 6. I was teaching 8th grade history at Jefferson Middle School and coaching the baseball team, and I had recently been told I was being considered for the vice principal position, which meant more money and more stability, and everything my father had wanted for me and that I had wanted for myself. My life was built. That is the only way I can describe it. It was a carefully constructed thing, and I was proud of it. And I was also, though I could not have told you this at the time, quietly terrified of anything that might knock it down. Thomas was living in Pittsburgh by then. He had married a woman named Dolores, and they had 2 kids, and he was working for a construction company, which was one of the more stable situations he had ever managed to find himself in. We did not see each other as often as we once had. Life had the effect it usually does, where you see someone less and less, not because anything has gone wrong, but because your own days fill up so completely that even the people you love most become people you will call next week, and then next month, and then at Christmas. We still talked on the phone. We still liked each other. But the closeness we had as boys had stretched into something thinner by 1967, and I think Thomas felt that more than I did. I think he missed me in a way I did not fully understand until it was too late to do anything about it. He came to visit in October of that year. Eleanor had taken the kids to her mother's house for a long weekend, and Thomas drove up from Pittsburgh on a Friday night, and we had the house to ourselves. That was unusual. That was the first small choice, really, though I would not have called it a choice at the time. I would have called it good timing. We had dinner, and we had drinks, more drinks than we normally would have had if Eleanor and the children had been there, and we talked the way you talk when you have been missing someone more than you realized. We talked about our father who had died the year before. We talked about Millhaven, and the people we had grown up with, and the way the town had changed. We laughed about things that had not seemed funny at the time, the way you can laugh at old trouble when enough years have put a comfortable distance between you and it. At some point in the evening, Thomas said he wanted to drive out to see the old house, our parents' house, the one we had grown up in, which had been sold after our father died. He had not seen it since the sale, and he said he wanted to see it one more time, just to look at it from the outside, just to remember. I said we had been drinking. He said we had not been drinking that much. This was not entirely true, but I told myself it was, and I got in the car with him because he was my brother, and it was late at night, and the roads would be empty, and it was only 15 miles, and we had driven worse. Both of us, when we were young and more careless. That was how I reasoned it at the time. That was the thing I told myself to justify getting in the car. Thomas was driving. I want to be precise about that. He was behind the wheel and I was in the passenger seat, and we were on Route 9, which was a 2-lane road that ran through the dark farmland between my house and Millhaven, and there was almost no traffic at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. I remember the radio was on. I remember the windows were down because it was one of those October nights that feels more like September, still warm, the kind of warmth that feels like a gift because you know it will not last. I remember Thomas was talking about Dolores, saying something about a disagreement they had been having about money, and I was half listening and watching the dark fields go by on either side of the road. I did not see the man until after. Thomas hit him on the right shoulder of the road. The man was walking apparently in the dark, at the edge of the pavement, and Thomas drifted slightly to the right, the way you drift when you have been drinking and you are not paying close attention. And there was an impact that I felt in my chest before I understood what it was. Thomas braked hard, and the car skidded and stopped, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Thomas said, very quietly, "What was that?" And I knew what it was before I looked. I knew from the sound and the feeling of it, and I believe Thomas did too. But he asked the question anyway, the way you ask questions when you are hoping the answer will be something manageable. We got out of the car. There was a man on the road behind us. He was alive. He was conscious. He was lying on his back and making sounds, and one of his legs was clearly badly injured. I do not know how old he was, probably in his 50s or 60s. I found out later his name was Gerald Marsh, and he was 58 years old, a man who worked at the grain elevator on the edge of Millhaven and who had been walking home from a friend's house because his truck would not start. He survived. I want to say that now because I think it matters, and because I think if he had not survived, this story might have gone differently for all of us. Gerald Marsh survived, but his leg was broken in 2 places, and he spent 3 months in the hospital and never walked quite right again for the rest of his life. What happened next is what I have lived with. Thomas was standing there looking at this man on the road, and I could see that he was panicking. He kept saying, "We have to call someone. We have to get help." But he was not moving toward the car to get to a phone, and he was not moving toward the man on the road, and he was just standing there in a state that I recognized, because I had seen Thomas panicking before, and it looked like this. It looked like paralysis. And I was not panicking. That is the thing. I have never been able to decide whether to be ashamed of or not. I was not panicking. I was thinking. And what I was thinking in those first moments on that dark road with a man injured behind our car was not about Thomas. It was about me. It was about my job and my family and the vice principal position and what Eleanor would say and what the town would say and whether I would lose everything I had spent 14 years building. I told Thomas to get back in the car. He looked at me. He said, "Arthur, we cannot leave." I said, "I know that." I said, "We are not leaving." I said, "Get in the car and I will call for help." I do not know entirely what I was thinking in that moment. I think part of me believed that I could manage this, that I could call for an ambulance and stay with the man until help arrived, and still somehow protect both of us from the worst of the consequences. But even as I thought that, I knew it was not going to be as simple as I was making it sound. Thomas had been drinking. I had been drinking. The police would come and there would be tests, and there would be questions, and there would be a story in the paper, and there would be consequences. And I was calculating all of that while Gerald Marsh was lying on the road behind us. I called for help. I will say that. I called from the car, and I gave them the location, and I said there had been an accident, and a man was injured, and then I told Thomas to drive. I told him to drive back to my house and park the car and go inside. And he did it because Thomas, in a panic, had always followed whoever was giving the clearest instructions. And at that moment, I was giving the clearest instructions. We drove home. We went inside. We sat in my kitchen, and we did not speak for a long time. And then Thomas said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "We are going to wait and see what happens." The police came to my house the next morning. Not because of any evidence, not because anyone had seen us, but because my car had been seen parked at an unusual angle in my driveway by a neighbor who thought something seemed off and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, the way things traveled in a small town in those days. A deputy came to the door and asked if I had been driving on Route 9 the previous evening, and I said no. He asked if Thomas had been there, and I said Thomas had come to visit, but that we had stayed in for the evening. I looked the deputy in the eye, and I lied with the same calm I had maintained since the moment I got back in the car. Thomas was in the kitchen. He heard me lie. He came to the doorway and stood there, and the deputy saw him and asked him the same question. And Thomas looked at me and then looked at the deputy. And Thomas, my reckless, impulsive, laughing brother who had never been as good at deception as I was, said that he had gone out for a drive. He said it just like that, flat and simple and incriminating. He said he had gone out for a drive by himself, late, along Route 9, and that he thought he might have hit something but was not sure and was scared and drove home. He said it as if he were confessing to something that had happened to him alone. He did not look at me while he said it. The deputy took him in for questioning that same day, and 3 days later Thomas was charged with leaving the scene of an accident involving serious bodily injury. I did not correct the record. I sat in my house and I thought about my children and my job and Eleanor and everything I had built, and I did not go to the police. and I did not go to Thomas's lawyer, and I did not tell the truth. I told Eleanor a version of events in which I had been asleep when Thomas went out, a version she accepted because she had no reason not to, because I was the careful one, the responsible one, the one who did not make trouble. Thomas pled guilty eventually to avoid a trial. He was sentenced to 18 months and served 14. Dolores left him while he was inside. He lost his job. When he came out, he was a different person in ways that took me years to fully see. Quieter, less willing to trust, less willing to laugh, as if the part of him that had always moved toward life with open hands had learned finally to keep them at his sides. We stayed in each other's lives. I do not know entirely why. I think Thomas stayed because he had nowhere else to go, not in the sense of having no home, but in the sense that I was his brother and I was the only person from before who was still there, even if I was also the person who had put him where he was. And I stayed because leaving would have meant admitting what I had done, and because I loved him, genuinely, even through all of it, even with everything I was carrying. We had Christmas together every year. We sat at the same table and ate the same food and watched the same children grow up and said nothing about Route 9, ever. Not once in the 50 years between that night and the day Thomas died in 2019. He died in February of 2019 at the age of 88 in a hospital in Pittsburgh, and I was there, and I held his hand, and I still said nothing. He never asked me directly. I do not know if that means he wanted to protect me, or if he had already decided the truth of it on his own and had made some kind of peace with it that I have never been able to find for myself. That is the weight of it. That is the shape of what I have been carrying. I have thought over the years about why I did not speak up. I have turned it over and over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at it from every angle, trying to find something in it that explains it without simply condemning it. And I have found some things. I was afraid, genuinely and completely afraid, in a way that I think shrank my whole field of vision down to nothing but my own survival. I had children who needed me. I had a wife who depended on me. I told myself those things so many times they became a kind of story. The story of a man who had to make an impossible choice to protect his family, and I lived inside that story for decades before I could see it clearly enough to know that it was mostly fiction. The truth is simpler. The truth is that I was a coward, and that my cowardice had a price, and Thomas paid it. I got the vice principal position the following year. I held it for 11 years before becoming principal, which I was for 9 years after that. I coached baseball for 2 more decades and retired with that plaque I mentioned, and a good pension, and a house that was paid off, and 3 children who loved me, and 7 grandchildren who thought I was wonderful. My life, from the outside, was everything it was supposed to be. I am not saying that to sound pitiable. I am saying it because I think it is the most honest part of this whole account. The consequences of what I did not destroy my life. They destroyed Thomas's, and I went right on living, and the living was good, and I am not sure what to do with that fact even now. Eleanor died in 2001. She never knew, as far as I am aware. I have sometimes thought about what she would have done if she had known, and I cannot decide whether she would have left me or stayed, whether she would have been horrified or whether she would have found some way to understand it the way she found a way to understand most things about me. Eleanor was a generous person. She was more generous than I deserved. I think about that too. My daughter, Patricia, the one I told part of this to, has not brought it up since that conversation. We talk every week on the phone, and we talk about the grandchildren and her husband and what is on television and what the doctor said at my last appointment. And we do not talk about Thomas or about 1967. And I understand that she may be protecting me, or she may simply not know what to say. I am not asking her to do anything with it. I am not sure I have the right to ask anything of anyone at this point. What I am left with at 98 is this question, and I do not know the answer to it. I have looked for it in church, and I have looked for it in the private accounting you do of your own life when you are old enough to see it as a whole. and I have not found it with any certainty. The question is whether something like what I did can be redeemed, and if so, what redemption actually means for a person in my position. I do not mean legal redemption, because the law long ago stopped being interested in Route 9. I mean the other kind, the kind that has to do with whether you can die as someone other than the person who did the worst thing they ever did. I have heard people say that redemption is always available if you are honest and if you are sorry. I am honest. I am sorry, genuinely and completely sorry, in a way that has not diminished with age but has, if anything, grown heavier as I have had more time to understand the full shape of what I took from Thomas. But I am not sure that being honest and sorry is sufficient, particularly when the person you wronged is no longer here to receive the honesty or the sorrow. Thomas had a son named Daniel. Daniel is in his 60s now. He knows his father went to prison. He knows the broad outlines of the story, but I do not believe he knows that I was in that car. I have thought about calling Daniel. I have thought about writing him a letter. I have started that letter in my head more times than I can count, usually in the small hours of the morning when sleep is difficult and the quiet of the house is complete, and there is nothing between me and the thing I did. I have not sent the letter. I tell myself it is because hearing this truth would only cause Daniel pain without giving him anything useful in return, that his father is gone, and the story is over, and introducing this now would simply be one more wound in a family that has had enough of them. I tell myself that, and I half believe it, and I half know that I am still, even at 98, finding reasons to protect myself first. There is a man named Gerald Marsh, who I injured, and whose life I made harder, and whose name I have thought of more times than I can count over the past 57 years. I do not know if Gerald Marsh is still alive. He would be in his late 80s or early 90s if he is. I do not know what he understood about that night, whether he ever knew who was really driving, whether it mattered to him after a while, or whether it became just the fact of the limp and the years of discomfort that his body carried, whether or not he knew the name of the person responsible. I have wanted to find him. I have not. I have told myself it is too late, that he may be gone, that reaching out now would only dredge up something painful for a man who has moved on. And again I know, even as I say it, that there is some measure of self-protection in that reasoning. I am telling you all of this not because I expect absolution from a story told out loud. I am old enough to understand that absolution does not work that way, that you cannot simply speak a true thing and have the weight of it lift. I think I am telling you because silence has its own cost, and I have paid that cost for a very long time, and I am tired of it. Because Thomas deserved better than what he got, and he cannot hear me say so now, but saying so still feels like something that needs to be said, even into the air, even without him here to receive it. Because I think there is something in the telling itself that is different from the years of not telling. Even if the telling does not fix anything and does not bring my brother back and does not give back the years he lost, or the marriage, or the job, or the particular way he used to laugh before he went to prison and came out quieter. I have had a long life, I know that. 98 years is not something everyone gets, and I am aware of that in a way that I was not when I was younger, and the years seem to stretch out in front of me without visible limit. I have had a long life, and most of it has been genuinely good, full of people I loved and work I was proud of, and small pleasures that accumulated into something I would call a fortunate existence if I were being honest. And alongside all of it, underneath all of it, there has been this. There has been October of 1967, and a dark road, and a man lying on the pavement, and my brother's face when he looked at me before he told the deputy he had gone out alone. I carry all of it together, the good and the terrible, and I cannot separate them, and I am not sure anyone can, when they reach the end of a life and look back at the full length of it. If you are young, or even if you are not young, and you are somewhere in the middle of a moment where the wrong choice is the easy choice, where staying quiet costs you nothing in the short term and speaking up costs you everything, I want you to know something. I want you to know that the short term ends. I want you to know that the person you protect by staying quiet is the person you will have to look at in the mirror for the rest of your life. And that is a longer relationship than it sounds when you are standing on a dark road calculating your options. I am not saying this to give you a lesson, because I do not think I have the standing to give lessons on this particular subject. I am saying it because it is the truest thing I know, the thing I have earned by being wrong about it for 57 years. My brother Thomas was a better person than I gave him credit for being. He was reckless and irresponsible, and he made his own share of mistakes over the course of his life, but he was also generous and funny and genuinely kind, in a way that was not calculated the way my kindness sometimes was. He did not deserve what happened to him. He did not deserve to carry something that was mine to carry, and he carried it anyway, quietly, without ever once, in 50 years of holidays and phone calls and family dinners, saying to me, "Arthur, I know what you did." Maybe he did know. Maybe that silence was his version of mercy. If it was, then he was more merciful to me than I was to him, and I have to live with that, and I will, for however much longer I have. My name is Arthur Pemberton. I am 98 years old. I let my brother go to prison for what I did, and I have lived with that for more than half a century, and I am still not sure what a person does with a thing like that except to finally say it out loud before the time to say it is gone. That is all I have. That is the whole of it. I hope Thomas knew that I loved him. I believe he did. I hope that is worth something. I am not entirely sure it is.